Mode.
Hi everyone, my name is Brittany Kavinsky and I just want to welcome everyone. It is now 1 p.m. so we will begin our presentation shortly. Today on September 16th we will have our presentation on Successful Developer RFP Processes, the Do's and Don'ts, given by Rob Hunden. Let's see if I can advance. Okay. For help during today's webcast, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box found in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, or call 1-800-263-6317. For content questions, please feel free to type those in the questions box and we will be able to answer those at the end of the presentation during the question and answer session. Here's a list of the sponsoring chapters, divisions, and universities. I would like to thank all of the participating chapters, divisions, and universities for making these webcasts possible. Also, the Economic Development Division for hosting today's webinar. As you can see, we have a couple webcasts coming up in the next few months. To register for these upcoming webcasts, please visit www.utah-apa.org/webcast and register for your webcast of choice. You can now follow us on Twitter at Planning Webcast to receive up-to-date information on the Planning Webcast series sponsored by chapters, divisions, and universities. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please go to www.planning.org/CM, select today's date, which is Friday, September 16th, and then select today's webcast, Successful Developer RFP Processes, the Do's and Don'ts. This webcast is available for 1.5 CM credits. We are recording today's webcast and it will be available along with a 6-slide per page PDF of the presentation at www.utah-apa.org/webcast-archive. At this time, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Rob Hunden. Rob Hunden is the president of AICP and offers extensive experience in managing the feasibility and implementation of major real estate projects as well as organizational development. Since launching Hunden Strategic Partners, he has been a sought-after consultant for dozens of hotel, convention, mixed-use entertainment, and retail projects, as well as other tourism and economic development projects and master plans. He also has experience moving organizations to a position of focus and action through strategic planning initiatives. Prior to starting the firm, he served as vice president of C.H. Johnson Consulting in Chicago. There he conducted nearly 100 destination development assignments for the firm, specializing in hotels, conference centers, sports, urban entertainment retail districts, and convention center developments. He also managed much of the firm's work on performing arts and tourism projects during his 5-year tenure. Some notable projects include the new Omni Convention Hotel in Fort Worth, the Erie Bayfront Convention Center and Sheraton Arena projects in Kansas City and Albuquerque, 4th Street Live in Louisville, the Kansas City Power and Light District, and the Nassau Coliseum redevelopment. Prior to joining CHJC, he worked for several years on real estate finance and transaction activity for a number of projects at Landauer Associates and Grubb & Ellis, which purchased Landauer in 2000. In this capacity, Mr. Hunden sought financing for hotels and other real estate projects across North America, giving him a real-world perspective on how banks and other financial players analyze various real estate developments. He also conducted transaction work involving hotel, retail, apartment, and industrial assets. His public sector experience began at the Indianapolis Bond Bank, which is Indianapolis's Economic Development Finance Authority. There he worked for the mayor's office and the board bank on the Indiana Convention Center expansion, financing for the RCA Dome renovation and Conseco Fieldhouse construction, managed the pre-development process for the Indianapolis Downtown Marriott Convention Hotel, managed the redevelopment strategy for Union Station and Glendale Mall, among many other community development projects, including retail, entertainment, tourism, and special events. Mr. Hunden has written articles on economic development topics, including on the subject of convention headquarter hotels for the Economic Development Journal, and taught destination development and tourism courses at Kendall College. He has been active in special event and nonprofit work, serving on the boards of the Murat Center for the Performing Arts. He is currently board president for Imagination Theater in Chicago and is involved in the Arts and Business Council of Chicago, and served on the board of Chicago Games, Inc. from 2000 to 2007. Having conducted the feasibility study for the City of Chicago for the Chicago Fashion Incubator, he also serves on the board of the new nonprofit Chicago Fashion Development, Inc. He has participated in bids for national sporting and political events in Indianapolis and Chicago and has been a volunteer for events such as the RCA Tennis Championships. Mr. Hunden is a member of the International Society of Hospitality Consultants, the Urban Land Institute, the International Economic Development Council, the International Downtown Association, the Congress for New Urbanism, the International City-County Management Association, and the Government Finance Officers Association. He has been a speaker and conducted panel discussions at IEDC's If You Build It, Will They Come? Conferences in Kansas City, Tempe, Arizona, and Tampa, Florida, as well as taught courses for IEDC's professional development courses in Columbus, Ohio, and San Antonio. He will speak on financing public-private developments at the 2008 Cutting Edge Public-Private Partnerships. Let's all welcome Rob Hunden.
Well, good morning, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Normally, I would ask, how are you doing? But since I can't hear you, I'll just assume that everyone's having a fantastic Friday. Are you seeing my screen?
Not yet.
Okay.
Go ahead and click Show My Screen.
All right.
There we go.
How about now?
Yep.
We're good to go. Okay, great. Okay, everybody. Well, welcome, and thanks so much for having me. That was a very long introduction, and I apologize that you had to read through all that and listen to it. But I guess the big picture is I've been on both sides of the public, private, and kind of the consultant side. So I guess really three sides of the RFP process. And so this is something that we honestly see that the public sector could do a lot better job in terms of reaching their goals if they understood kind of how the private sector views RFQs and RFPs and kind of what it takes to get a good crop of responses. So just as an overview, it's something where we do see our clients need a lot of help with this, and they don't usually realize they know it, that they need that help until after they have maybe failed to achieve their goals a couple of times through maybe not as well-written RFPs or RFQs. So today I think it's important to kind of understand what's important in a process in order to get a development. So let's, first of all, see if I can advance the slide. Hold on. For some reason it's not letting me advance. Here we go. All right. So, as you know, developer selection is often initiated through either a request for qualifications or a request for proposal, and we'll kind of get into what the differences are here in a minute. The purpose of the RFQ or RFP is a tool to achieve a public goal. It's a means of introducing competition into a redevelopment project to ensure a qualified development team is selected, and it's a marketing tool to attract private development. So really, the second two are the most important. You've identified something that you want to have built for you, or maybe it's an RFQ or an RFP to hire a consultant or an architect or something like that. It doesn't always have to be to go out and get a developer. But what you're really trying to do is, instead of just handpicking someone who happens to be local, you're going out to the marketplace and really trying to find a good match between your project and a service provider out there that can actually produce your desired result. And by putting competition into the process, then you're more likely to get more for your money. And obviously a competitive bid situation is always preferred. And we see that even in the consulting realm as well. And of course, it's a marketing tool. So we like to think it's like these processes are a little bit like Match.com between the private and public sector. But the process and the integrity of the process is really one of the most important things. And so what I hope you will leave with today is an understanding of how to make a process full of integrity so that you have trust. Because if the private sector does not believe that the public sector either knows what they're doing or is serious about what they're doing, or is doing it all above board, there's not some sort of inside job going on, then they will stay away. So we're going to kind of talk through that. Some of the most important things that you're going to do to achieve success are going to be taken care of before you even issue the RFQ or the RFP. And those things are, you really need to know what you're getting into. So you want to gain, let's say you want to build, you want to have someone build a mixed-use project for you that's going to have some public financing, some private financing. You want to first of all make sure you have political consensus on the project concept, and you want to understand what the range of possible incentives are. So we see a lot of times a mistake that is made is that communities say, oh, we want a hotel, or we want an arena, or whatever the case may be, and they haven't done any studies. They just think it's a really good idea, and it's what their mayor wants, or it's what you know, that the head of the economic development wants, or planning, or whatever, and so they issue an RFP without having done a study to understand really what is the market situation. If you do that, typically it's pretty evident via what you've written in your RFQ or RFP. If the development community does not believe that you understand what you're getting yourself into, they're much less likely to respond. So we would say, if you're going to go out for whatever the development is, have a feasibility study done first by your own third-party consultant. And in fact, those are the kinds of things that we do every day, and so we see this process, and a lot of times we get called in to do these studies after a failed version of the RFQ goes out or RFP goes out and they didn't get any responses. So it's important to know what you're getting yourself into. So understand the project feasibility first. Have the market numbers run, have the financial feasibility run, because, for example, if something is not feasible to be built by the private sector, i.e. there's a gap in financing, you're going to want to know that, and you're going to want to know what the public's participation level is about to be. One of the things that turns off developers is if you go out for development and it's very clear that there needs to be a public subsidy, but you haven't suggested that you realize that there will be or how much it will be. So again, it seems like a big fishing expedition, so you don't want to do that. You want to know, and that's why the political buy-in is so critical. We like to tell our clients, make sure you know what the tools are in your toolbox to fill these gaps or make the process work, so that you can communicate that through the RFQ or the RFP and get confidence from the respondents that they know you're an active partner. Because remember, if something was feasible for the private sector to do without public support, they probably would have already done it. Those kinds of developments get built all the time. Starbucks and McDonald's and limited service hotels on the sides of highways and industrial buildings with tenants. Those things get built all the time without public support. But the kinds of projects that often our clients are going out for and that planners and mayors want to have done are things that take a little bit of public support, they take a little bit of magic, they take a lot of work and a lot of effort and time. So and developers know that, and they're not, most of these developers specialize in these kinds of things, these public-private deals. And so I just can't underscore enough the importance of having understood your project and what you're going for in advance. We also have clients that will go out for just a big picture development concept, maybe not even a concept, but they'll go out for a developer for a large swath of land without any specific vision. That can also be a problem because there's not that specificity. So again, where we say specificity is key, it's really important to know what you are seeking. If it's going to be very random and you're saying, hey, we want a developer to develop these 10 acres or these 25 acres or these 5 acres, whatever the site size is, if everybody comes back with apples, oranges, and bananas, it's going to be very hard for you to compare and choose the right developer. So then you're going to be doing it based on qualifications. So not having a specific vision in mind and then not really having any studies to back up that vision, it all leads to just kind of a crapshoot. And that's exactly what you're going to end up with. So be very specific going in as to what you want to accomplish, what you want to build. Let the community know that you and the developers know through the RFQ, the RFP, that you've done your homework, you understand what it's going to cost them, what it's going to cost you, and all that. You don't have to put all those details in, although we do suggest that you attach the feasibility study because that lets them know you're serious. Have an understanding of bidding laws, requirements, and confidentiality. That's part of the integrity of the process. One of the things that we often find is that developers will have lots of relationships with a lot of politicians, and you want to make sure that the communication the lines of communication are very specific between the developers and those who are going to be making the determination about the process moving forward. Because another thing that will turn developers off to a project is if they suspect that it's going to go to a local guy because he, donated money to the mayor's campaign or whatever the situation may be. Or some communities have a reputation, or states have a reputation for only choosing firms that are from those states. So if you want to be as open as possible, be very strict in your communication language about who can talk to whom throughout the process so that you gain the confidence of those who may not otherwise participate in the process. You want to make sure you know who's in charge, what the selection criteria are going to be, and what the timeline of the selection process is. But you also want to have a little bit of flexibility in that timeline to make sure that if things change, as they often do throughout a process, that you have a little flexibility there. Okay. What's another really important thing? As it relates to land, you can own the land, which puts you in control. You can seek a developer for a site not controlled by the public, or you can look for a developer or development in an unspecified site. Again, the more specificity you have, the better, and most developers will not respond to an RFQ or an RFP where the city or public agency does not at least control the land. They may not own it, but they need to control it. Because then, really, if you don't control the situation, then what the developer is looking at their expenditure of time and effort and the likelihood that they're going to get paid at the end of the day if they take the risk on this development. If you don't even own the land yet or control it, what's the timeline for that? We have a client right now that was very adamant about moving forward with an offering of land and to find a developer, even though they didn't control most of the site. That was very difficult for us because we had to try to convince developers that they should respond to this even though the city didn't control all the land. So it's very difficult. So we do recommend that the public sector controls the land. There are a couple ways to look at, should you do an RFQ or an RFP? And one of the things that, just big picture, that you should know is that in many states, in order to actually convey land and to offer land, you have to do an RFP. An RFQ, just to submit qualifications versus a proposal, that's the difference between the Q and the P, doesn't allow you to convey that land. So, but typically what happens is, and the reason that the RFQ typically precedes the RFP is because what you want to do is you want to maximize the opportunity and minimize the time and effort involved in the process. So for the respondents and for you. So the RFQ is the qualifications process that then narrows down to an RFP, which gets much more specific and is more time consuming. If you go straight to an RFP, you may have a lot of respondents that are not necessarily even qualified to get to that level, and so you may turn off people who are qualified. You also may make yourself do a lot more work by having to comb through a lot of responses that you should have never had to respond to. So the RFQ gets the qualifications. Once they're qualified, then you can narrow it down to an RFP and get more specific. So let's talk about an RFQ. Request for qualification is an invitation to potential developers, or again, if you're seeking a consultant, architect, whomever, to just really gets the word out, gets a response from groups with their qualifications, which most firms, whether they're a developer or an architect or a consulting firm or whatever the case may be, most of those groups have their qualifications pretty well lined up to go, and they're going to submit those pretty easily. It doesn't take a lot of time, so that's good. It provides you enough information to help you choose a short list for further consideration. So if you get 10 or 15 responses, you can cast that wide net, say, hey, this is what we're thinking. We'd like to build an arena, or we'd like to build a mixed-use project. Tell us if you are qualified. And so once those responses come in, you can say, okay, who's the most qualified out of this group? We don't want to waste anyone's time, so in order not to have 10 people or 10 companies submitting an RFP that we'll have to go through and that they'll have to come and interview and all of that, let's narrow it down to a top 5 or 6 based on those who we feel have the most qualifications for what we want to try to do. And then when you do that, that actually provides more likelihood that those who are shortlisted will actually respond and go through the whole process. We've had situations that we've seen where, because they didn't go from a large list to a short list, people just said, you know what, it's not worth our time, it's not worth our effort, you clearly don't know what you're doing, you're wasting our time. And we've seen that too, where we had to go to, we submitted a proposal to a town, a capital city in the southeast, and they brought every single one in for an interview, and it was the most expensive place to fly to in the country. I felt like it was about $1,000 a ticket, and everybody just kind of got there and was upset. And then, of course, they canceled the RFP process altogether after we had all flown there to interview. So you want to give the respondents confidence that they have a shot at winning. So going from the wide net and the large list to a short list is a good idea. The other thing that it allows you to do, in a lot of situations, in most cities, there are 2 or 3 local developers or construction companies that seem to always have the in on things. And again, it's the political connections and all those things that can occur. And if you have someone that's only built post offices or only built industrial type buildings, and then all of a sudden you have a specialty development that comes up, like say a hotel or performing arts center or a mixed-use project or whatever it is that's very different from what the local groups are used to doing, they may submit their qualifications based on their local location and their connections and all that. But if they're not qualified and you get responses from all of those other groups outside of the community who are qualified, that gives you a very clear way, without having to kind of get caught in a political situation, of saying, here are the groups that are the most qualified, here are the groups that are not, and we're going to shortlist it to those groups that are the most qualified. So again, it's the integrity of the process and the transparency that we feel that really helps with. Again, just to remind you, if you're going to convey property, check your state's redevelopment law to make sure you don't need to do an RFP versus an RFQ, because in many instances that is a critical component. Now, when would be, let's go back. When would be a time when you would only want to do a request for qualifications and not a proposal? Well, it would be a situation where we wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but if you have a situation where you have a site and you say, we want a big kind of mixed use, we don't know exactly what we want, but we want a mix of uses, or we want something like this, or something like an arena and a hotel and a grocery store. If you really haven't gotten specific and you want the developer to actually come in and do a master plan and do all the kind of visioning and specificity for you, again, it's harder to get to that point, but if you just say, you know what, we want to develop this area and we don't even know exactly what we want and we don't really care, we just want a few things few key points, we'd like to identify those developers who really have experience in this and can come and do a master plan. That really shows that you're way back in the process, and that's okay. And it makes sense then to do a request for qualifications only, and then based on the best qualified developer that you go through the interviews and say, okay, we want to pay them a retainer or whatever sort of fee to go through the actual master planning process, the feasibility process, and kind of like walk us through the whole thing. Most of our clients prefer to do all those things themselves up front and then go look for a developer once they've determined what they want to build. But if you want the developer to actually kind of be your consultant through the process and figure out what to build and how to build it and draw pictures and do all those things, then you can do an RFQ only. Okay. How about a request for proposal? All right, so whether or not you've done the RFQ first, the RFP is much more specific. What it usually is asking for are as many of the specifics related to a specific proposal as possible. So let's say that you want someone to come in and build a convention hotel. Then you're going to ask them, you're going to hopefully show them by attaching your feasibility study that you've done a study, that you understand the market, you understand the financials, you want to know, and hopefully you'll say, we want 100, let's just pick a number, 175 rooms, or between 150 and 200 rooms. But be as specific as you can, because then you're going to say to them, come back to us with an actual proposal of what you're going to build, what's the brand going to be, how's it going to look on the site, what's the cost going to be, what's the financial projection that you've run compared to what we've run, what kind of incentives do you need, all that kind of thing. So you're really getting to specifics, timeline, budget, design, who's going to be running the project, who's the owner, who's the developer, who's the brand, who's the operator, all those kinds of things. It's a lot of specificity that they have to provide in an RFP, and it's a lot more work than an RFQ. And if you do if you don't do an RFQ process and you do maybe say a two-stage RFP, then you'll also ask for qualifications in the RFP process. So you'll ask for qualifications and you'll ask for their specific proposal. And then you have the option then of going through the proposals and then shortlisting from there and then doing interviews from there, et cetera, et cetera. So you can do the qualifications and the proposal in the same package. Just remember that it is very, you all know from your perspective, if you're the one issuing the RFP or the RFQ, it takes a long time to write these and make sure that they're good and that they're not contradictory in nature, that the dates on one page aren't contradictory with the dates on another page, and what you're asking for it makes sense. So imagine the time it takes for a developer or any other company to respond to an RFP. They have to do exactly what you say. in terms of, is it going to be two-sided, double-spaced, recycled paper, don't use plastic, do use plastic binding, all these things. That's just one part of it. But then having the drawings done, having the budgets running the market studies, all that takes a lot of time. And so you want to make sure that you're very specific with what you want, but don't ask for the sun, moon, and stars, because you're going to turn groups off. A lot of groups will want to get to maybe the short list first before they invest a lot of time, like running so many numbers and spending so much time, because honestly, it just is exhausting. They've got to, buy plane tickets. They've got to buy data. They've got to work with architects. They've got to. There's just a ton of time and effort, and so you want your process to be as smart and cohesive as possible, and not waste anybody's time. So, what does the RFP include? It includes what your project concept is and the background of the project, kind of like how you got to this point, how you look to move forward. Do you have a conceptual design that you've already done? That saves them a little bit of work. Have you done a market study like we talked about? That saves them a lot of time and effort. If they put faith in your market study, then that saves them not only time and effort, but it gives them confidence, that you know what you're doing. And because it saves them time and effort, it means that they're more likely to respond, because they don't have to run out and do all that legwork. You may not want to suggest the details of a deal structure, but what we often tell our clients is, if you know there's going to be public financial participation involved, then say that very specifically. Say, we've done our study. We know that this is going to take public participation in some form or another. We have identified the following tools as possible inducements for the project. Those include, say, tax increment financing, tax rebates, tax abatements. It could be a direct public subsidy, or the city or county or public sector may contribute the land. They may contribute some public infrastructure costs. They may contribute a parking garage. Whatever it is, make a list of those possible options, and the things that you're sure of, you can actually say, we are planning to contribute these to the project because we know it buys down the cost for the private sector. We're working with one community now, Evansville, Indiana, that is that based on kind of a non-successful first go-round at getting a convention hotel developed, they determined that there was going to be a subsidy needed, and they felt like $8 million sounds about right based on what everybody's telling us from the first response. So they spent a lot of time and effort getting to that number instead of doing their studies, but at least then when they went out with their second version of the RFP, they could say, we've now committed to $8 million for this project. So then that gave some companies confidence that the city had a better handle on reality and was able to get a couple of qualified responses. The RFP should also include what's the operational relationship and the owner and the governance relationship that you expect. Are you expecting to own the land and then lease it for 99 years? Do you want the private sector to own and operate the improvements? Basically, what's the relationship that you see? Has there been a financial analysis done? Again, just like the feasibility study, if it's a market and financial feasibility study, all those things will be captured within that. It saves everybody a lot of time and effort and guessing. And what you could say is, this is another great way to actually compare apples to apples, is you can say to all the respondents, take the projections from our feasibility study as gospel at this point and tell us what the subsidy would need to be or the participation by the public would need to be in order to get this project done. That way everybody is taking the same inputs and you're just comparing their response, their output from your inputs. And so you can kind of put everybody on the same page that way. What's your hoped-for schedule for the project and the developer selection? What's your evaluation criteria? What's the selection process? And again, with the integrity deal, you really want to make sure that the rules for contacting the agency, communication with politicos and all that kind of thing is very well spelled out. There's nothing that will turn off respondents more than thinking that there's inside baseball going on. So we really suggest that that's very explicit and that you communicate that. Okay, so really all those things will be part of an RFP. So in this outline you'll see a lot of the same things from the last two slides. And the other thing that you can do is have a little bit of flexibility. A lot of times, the banks and consulting firms look at things very kind of straight on, whereas developers can be very creative. So a lot of times when we're writing RFPs with our clients, we often put in there that we are looking for the developers to be creative, saying, here's what the public agency wants out of this whole deal, this whole project. Here are the goals. If you have a better way of getting us out of this than what the specifics are that we've suggested, respond to our specifics, but also say, here are some other things that we've done in other places, or here are some other ideas that we think might work. Because I continue to be surprised and pleasantly amazed. Wherever we go, there always seems to be a new creative program out there or concept that helps to make a project work that people hadn't necessarily thought about before. So a certain creativity is always helpful. So just make sure that what you've requested in your RFP is the same as what you've required in their response. A lot of times we see RFPs, whether, again, it's for consulting services or if it's for a developer, where they say in the first half of the document, here's what we want, and then in the second half of the document, they say, here's what we want in your proposal, and those things don't match. So you really want to make sure that the things that you ask for in one part of the document match what you've required in the rest of the document. And then tell them what the selection process is going to be. Again, as I was just saying, a certain flexibility. You want to make sure that you have the flexibility to work with creative ideas, but you also want the developer to know that they can propose some creative ideas without hurting their chances. So again, you want them to propose kind of some by-the-book things so that everybody's apples to apples, but if they have some other ideas, that they should suggest those, and they won't be fearful that they're going to get kicked out of the process for doing that. And just remember, this is something we'll reiterate over and over, and we do the same thing. If your community has reams of rules and regulations and proposed contracts that they put in and lots of additional forms and paperwork, it's just going to make it less likely that people are going to respond. So a lot of times you don't have control over that. Certain cities are just overly form happy, and you just have to deal with it. But the more streamlined you can make the process, the more chance you'll have of getting qualified developers. So you want to make sure that developers submit their corporate qualifications, examples of similar projects, references, understand who the people are that are going to be involved in this project. There are a lot of big companies out there that will be a part of a team, and you want to understand really who is the team itself. You could have a local developer that then teams with, say, a national hotel brand or a national architecture firm or a national real estate firm to do one small component of their project. But the developer, the guy or team or woman or whatever bringing the cash to the project is that one person or that one group. So they may try to throw around that they've got this national whatever firm on their team, but if they're only providing one little thing and they're not providing the cash for the deal, then you need to know that. You need to understand what is the org chart for this team, who's actually participating, and whose capital is at risk. Because at the end of the day, it all comes down to money, especially these days. If a project can't get financed, then you know, you're going to have to start from scratch again. So don't let these big names fool you. Find out who the true people are involved in a project. You want to have the developer right that they understand the approach and that they understand the project. And we typically do that whether we're asking for someone to respond to an RFP or we're actually responding to one ourselves. We kind of write back to them that we think we understand what they're trying to achieve, we understand the questions they're trying to answer, we understand that they're trying to build X, Y, and Z by this time and with what approach. And that then, it's just communication that helps both sides. The developers should also submit their proposed development programs and commitments. Then, what do they expect out of the public sector? What are they going to provide? What's their equity going to be? What are their debt commitments? Do they have banks? Do they have letters of reference, letters of commitment from financing entities? What have they proposed? A lot of times we'll see that developers have proposed financing that is contingent upon evaluation, not evaluation, but a valuation of the project. So if the project is valued at $100 million and they have a banking commitment for a 75% loan to value, that's great. But in a lot of these kinds of projects, the cost of the project is higher than the value to the private sector, which is why it requires a public-private partnership. So if the $100 million project is only worth 80, then 75% loan to value is going to be a lot less. And so you got to figure out who's going to make up that difference. You want to know what their operating projections are for the project, as well as, again, their financial credentials. Do they have, if they're proposing, $5 million in equity, do they have $5 million in the bank, or how are they expecting to get that? Who's got it? So you want to get personal or corporate financials, balance sheets from those key players. And it's, unless you're actually dealing with a public type of company, a large company that's going to be the developer, then having those public company balance sheets is not going to help you. We've seen that in projects a lot, where they'll have a large firm, a large brokerage firm, or a large hotel firm that is part of their team, and they'll provide their financials. Well, they're not providing the financing for this project, so we don't care about what their financials are. We care about the people who are going to be going to the bank and taking risks on this. So make sure you get the proper financials. And they should also submit references for other projects so that you can find out, did it go well? Did it go well with another project in another city? Find out what the story was. Okay, so how do you get this RFP or RFQ out to the development community? This has actually changed a lot just as communication has changed over the last few years. It used to be that you would take out an ad in the local business journal, the local paper, the Wall Street Journal, those kinds of things. These days it's almost all done online and through consultants, because we deal with these developers all the time as an example. So and we have relationships, and we can say to these guys, here's a project, here's a community that's really serious about doing X, Y, Z. We think you should take a look at this based on what you've done in the past. Otherwise, it's kind of a crapshoot. You're getting it out there, but you can do it through. You can do it through. You can still do it through the local real estate journal. You can let. You could do a press release, those kinds of things. You can do it through websites of the national organizations like ULI, IEDC, all of those, APA, those kinds of things. There's another way you can do it. We subscribe to a service called Onvia, and that is a clearinghouse of public agencies that are issuing RFPs. And so we have our keywords in for things that we're interested in seeing. And so then you can put your RFPs or RFQs out on something like Onvia, and there are a couple other public agency clearinghouses like that you can get your RFPs and RFQs out on. So it's important to get those out to the right list of people. Okay. So once you've received the responses, well, first of all, you should probably be in touch with folks during the response process. So you want to, first of all, make sure you give them enough time to respond to it. If it's an RFP and there's a lot of detail involved, you probably want to give them at least 4 to 6 weeks to respond, because they're having to do a lot of work, including design work and some market research and things of that nature. You want to be able to be available to answer questions. You want to make sure that that you're in communication with as many of the potential respondents as possible to find out, do they have questions? Is there anything that is kind of sticking in their craw that's making them not want to respond? Because really you want to get as many high-quality responses as possible. So that is, we have found one of the things we're often asked to do by cities is say, hey, you know, we've issued the RFP for them or help them write it, or they've already written it and sent it out, and then they say, help, we're concerned that we're not going to get any responses. So then we come in and make sure it gets to a good list, but then we follow up with those folks by email and by phone and say, hey, did you get this? Are you planning to respond? If not, why? Do you have questions? That kind of thing. It makes a big difference. So you got to kind of work your list. And then determine who's going to be on the selection committee. What's your criteria going to be? You've hopefully already thought about that. Make sure everybody's on the same page with the rating system. And then you want to make sure that you have a good process for evaluating the responses, so that if you're going to do interviews, that you only interview those that you really seriously feel like could pull this off. And so then you want to meet the folks and kind of understand, are we going to be able to get along with these people? You know, like it or not, there's a very kind of regionalist kind of attitude a lot of times. So like if we're working on a project, say, in the middle of the country, and an East Coast group comes along, our client may or may not feel real comfortable with that. We've seen it happen. Whereas if with a more local group comes along, they, oh yeah, we get along, but you just never know. So you really want to make sure that once you've narrowed it down, apples to apples, that you can bring in those groups to interview, and make sure you understand what you want them to present when they interview. You can even ask them to answer more questions before they come to the interview. And then instead of picking a developer, you rank your developers, and so that allows you to start negotiating with the top ranked group. And then if for some reason things don't go well, you can say, well, we didn't pick you, we just ranked you first, so we're going to put you to the side now since things didn't work out, and we'll go to the second ranked group. So it gives you a little bit of flexibility there. And then once you've gotten to kind of a memorandum of understanding with your selected group or your preferred group, then you can go and get approval to move forward and authorize that MOU. So what are the criteria typically included in this? The appropriateness of the project concept, the creativity of the concept, economic development benefits to the community. What is the, you want to, of course, limit your risk as a community and maximize your return. And you want to understand that the group is experienced with this kind of project and has done similar things before with your kind of agency. What about the financial strength? Always it comes down to money. Ultimately, if you can't pay for it, you can't build it. So you may have to end up taking a less whiz-bang deal than project than you had initially considered. A lot of this happened in Indianapolis when I was at the mayor's office. We really wanted a 1,000-room hotel. Well, at the end of the day, it just wasn't feasible, and neither was a 600-room hotel, but at least we had the money to make a 600-room hotel happen. We didn't have the money to make a 1,000-room hotel happen. So they did the 600-room hotel, and then 10, 15 years later, then they were able to do a 1,000-room hotel. The market had matured enough, and they were a bigger deal by that time that they could make the 1,000-room hotel work. And it was the same group that did the 600-room hotel, so they knew the community well at that point. So understand the financial strength of the proposed deal and be realistic about what you can and can't make happen in your community. You may have to do things in steps. Is design a big deal? Is LEED certification a big deal? Whatever those kind of key hot button issues are in your community, make sure those aren't forgotten. And you want to make sure that the responses are thorough, creative, and clear so that they followed all the requirements. Again, talking about not selecting a developer but preferring a top-ranked developer, you want to make sure that you always kind of keep them ready to negotiate and to think that if we don't do this well, somebody else may come along, subject to satisfactory negotiations. The MOU, or letter of intent, is the document that really records the key commitments and key business terms as part of the deal. You want to make sure that everybody's kind of on board with that. Again, the memorandum of agreement or understanding or letter of intent, basically between the parties, is the agreement with the preferred developer. It defines the project, it details the performance and schedule obligations, it sets the performance guarantees, it determines the financial structure, and sets that forth as best as possible with room for changes as they come up. It may be, there may be a lot of things that are subject to or contingent upon, but you want to get as much down on paper as you can that you can all agree on, so that you can kind of say, okay, this is kind of what we're intending to do together. Now we'll go and get into the specifics of a development agreement while we finish our studies, go to our banks, do all those kinds of things. So the development agreement puts the MOU or MOA into a legal document. It becomes a formal contract. The developer needs to secure private financing. Make sure you have a very good real estate attorney on your side of the table that understands redevelopment law, who's very creative and very smart. A lot of times your in-house attorney will not be, depending on the size of the community that you're in, your city attorney may not be that person. You want to get someone who has done kind of complex public-private real estate development projects before. We've seen that as a real critical component. And a bond attorney is also not always the right person. You, of course, will want the bond attorneys and bond folks handy, but making sure you have the right advisors throughout the process is really smart. Otherwise, you could get into trouble. One of the other things I would say is make sure you put a timeline into your agreements. We have a situation, we've seen situations where cities will enter into an agreement with a preferred developer that doesn't have a timeline, and so if they just drag it on and drag it on and drag it on and they don't get financing, then the city has no recourse and the developer is sitting pretty, well, not really sitting pretty, but the city's not able to dislodge them from the project because they haven't set that as a condition. So some of these will be kind of repetitive from what we talked about throughout the whole discussion, which is don't issue a blind RFP, don't go on a fishing expedition, and don't proceed without having done your studies first. Know how much money you're going to need to make a deal work. And again, developers don't want to waste their time. They don't want you to waste their time, and you don't want to waste your time. Going through this process 2 or 3 times because you didn't do it right the first time is going to be a big pain. And a lot of times cities do think that, well, we're going to give away the land and we have TIF, or something that every other city pretty much has, that's going to be all it takes to get this project done. But if you haven't done your analysis in detail or talked to the development community, you really don't know. And a lot of times that's not enough to get a project taken care of. Don't be swayed by beautiful pictures. You want to understand the real numbers behind everything and who is involved in a project. Understand your market and what's feasible. Make sure you have political support, not only for the project, but for the financial support that your project's going to need. Make sure you call references, do background checks on the developers, do internet homework and find out what's going on with those guys. If you want the developer to show a commitment to the project, then make sure that you're willing to do the same. Sometimes you're going to have to provide some upfront cash in a process to do either more studies or to share the burden with the developer, because in a situation like we have now, it's the city that wants the project. If it's not a financially viable project for the private sector, this developer that's coming along is basically a service provider to you. They're not looking at this as a get-rich-quick thing. They're saying, yeah, we will undertake this project on your behalf, but don't act like they're going to make all this money and they should therefore spend all this money once they're selected without any sort of quid pro quo or guarantees that they're going to move forward, because if it were up to them, they wouldn't have responded without the inducements that you're providing. So just remember that there has to be kind of a shared commitment going forward. Also remember, it is a relationship. You both have things to offer. You both have things to gain from this. And ultimately, it is a business decision, but you do need to get along with the people as best you can that are in this relationship. Some lessons that have been learned from public-private partnerships: make sure it's based on a plan and a vision, that you know where you want to go before you go out there to do it. We often see that those communities that do things quickest and do things best have a political champion. They have a mayor or a city manager or a town manager that is behind the project and really pulling it forward. It's very hard for the chief planner or consultants or other folks within the workings of city government or county government to make a project happen if it doesn't have that political support. So it's really important to have somebody pulling the project through the process. You want to make sure that as best you can that the project is supported by project revenues, and that any incentives that are coming back to the project are generated by the project. So for example, if you're doing a, whatever the kind of project is, if you have the ability to estimate what the net new taxes generated either through sales tax or property tax are from a project, that those are you could say, but for this project, these tax revenues wouldn't be generated. So if we're going to give $5 million to this project, you can, with a straight face, say to the community, we've done an analysis and we believe that this project is going to generate $6 million over the next 10 years of fiscal impact to the community, and we're going to dedicate $5 million back to it to make sure it happens. After the 10 years, then everything else is gravy to the community. So that return on investment analysis is important for the community. Make sure you're always communicating, but that the communication process is very strong and limited so that you don't get the politics involved. Involve stakeholders. Make sure that you have, like I said before, good attorneys and you do your homework in advance. Even though they do cost money, they will help you move your project forward. And make sure your consultants and attorneys have the kind of experience that you need on this project. We've gone into communities where they've had a local group run a study on a sports complex or a youth sports complex or whatever the case may be, and they really weren't in that business, but they convinced somebody that they were and made a study saying, hey, this is going to be the best thing since sliced bread. When you really look at it, show it to people across the country, then they go, yeah, not really. These numbers are way too high, they're too rosy. And so then the city's already bought into this concept. They say, oh yeah, we had this study. Well, the study wasn't that good. So now they're kind of looking like fools. So just make sure that you have good consultants and good attorneys as you move forward. Okay, make sure that no matter how invested you are in a project, you know when to walk away. Know that the RFQ and RFP process does take time, but screwing up a process by just jumping into bed with the first developer that comes along, which then puts you over a barrel if things go wrong, that takes even longer because then you're going to have to go through the process all over again. Remember that the private developer is a partner, not an adversary. Remember that attorneys and banks are always going to have stricter requirements than you probably would. You're going to have different goals. And then, it really all comes down to getting the financing closed and moving dirt. Until then, it's still conceptual. We have clients that will come to us and say, this project is going to do XYZ fantastic numbers, but at the end of the day, if those who are providing the money to the project don't believe those numbers and don't believe the developer, then it's not going to happen. So here are some bloopers. We see these all the time. Here are just some highlights. And this is one that always gets a chuckle because it doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence. The city may, in its sole discretion and without any obligation to act reasonably, may reject any and all proposals. Well, that's not really going to give us much confidence to respond now, is it? You could say, we really don't want you to submit a lengthy submittal to our response, but now we're going to require you to include 10,000 different things in your response. Well, that we run into that all the time. The communities want everything under the sun submitted, yet they limit the number of pages to 20. That's difficult. Again, make sure that what you've required in one part of the RFP or RFQ, it does not contradict or repeat what's been asked for again in another part of your document, because that happens. Again, make sure your dates are logical. They're gonna choose the recommended team before the responses are due, or within like 2 weeks or a week. Just make sure all those things are logical and in order, and give you enough time to do what you need to do. But again, you don't want to have them backwards. Here's another blooper from the same document. Among the listed selection criteria, quality of the development team's proposal product, not requested, but the degree of creativity shown in the development proposal was not requested. So again, make sure your criteria, and we have, again, seen this many times where they say, your response is going to be judged on these 5 things. But in the actual required submission, none of those things or a couple of those things weren't actually requested. So then as a respondent, the developer or whomever it is trying to figure out, okay, how do we let them know that we qualify with these things, but they haven't asked us to put it in the document anywhere. So it can be kind of confusing and complex. So that brings us to the end of the formal presentation. And I apologize, my allergies with this fall weather that's just hit Chicago has really gone crazy. So my ability to speak and breathe continuously is a bit challenged right now. But I'm going to take a breath and look for questions out there from folks in the group.
Great, Rob. Well, that was a great presentation. I think everybody really enjoyed it. Our first question here is, what is the best way to determine if a developer's financial expectations, rate of return desired from a particular project are reasonable and practical, or if they are unrealistic? For example, how does a public entity determine what an appropriate private market capitalization rate is for a particular project?
Okay, well, that's a perfect reason to have your consultant that knows these kinds of projects have done a study in advance, or you can actually have them come in after the fact. So we've done both. Normally, the feasibility study is done, and hopefully the market information, the results, first of all, in that study would have all of those things in it. Whenever we do a feasibility study that has the financial stack in it, we show what the banks require, we show what the equity required is, and we show what the gap is based on those two things. We know that banks these days require a lot more equity. We know that equity requires a lot more return. So the gaps are going to be bigger these days than they used to be, although the cost of borrowing is less. But all those numbers should be run for you before you go out for this so that you understand what really is realistic out there. If you haven't done it, and we have clients, like I said, that have not run these things, they will say get into bed with a developer, and the developer will suggest a development, let's say 150 units of market rate housing, and they'll say we need $5 million in subsidy. Well, then you have to have someone who knows how to run those things, a specialist in those fields, a feasibility expert, go and run through their numbers with them and also do their own kind of third-party due diligence to make sure that their numbers are legit. We're doing this right now on several of these projects, like I said, where we're looking at their construction budget. Is their construction budget high, low? What is going into their budget? What are their assumptions related to debt, equity, all those things. So, I mean, planners and redevelopment commission members and others in city government, it's not their job to be bankers, and it's not their job to be feasibility consultants. So how are you supposed to know what the truth is? You need to get a third-party perspective. And usually it's on your dime that that's going to happen. Obviously, you don't want the developer paying for a feasibility person because you want it to be completely objective. So that's the answer to that question.
Great. Our next question is, under some local redevelopment lays, you will need City Council approval to select a redeveloper, which also gives development rights over a certain period of time. How do you convince a developer that if you don't perform, someone is waiting in the wings to take this over once they have council approval?
Well, I think you want to have your groups ranked, and so even if you have to make a decision that they are on, like you mentioned, you want to make sure there is a specific period of time by which they have to perform certain things. Either they have to get their financing in place, or they have to do, various milestones, and it's then up to the council to, if they don't meet those, to either award the process to someone else or start the process over again. But it's good to have those groups waiting in the wings to say, hey, there were two other groups that were just almost as qualified as you are, that if you don't meet these milestones, then we have the ability to basically it's a breach of the agreement, and then we can break that agreement and go with the next best group. So you just it's another reason to go through this process and not just pick someone that's the mayor's buddy to do a project. It's a good reason to go through the RFP process and have multiple respondents that you feel good about.
Great. So our next question is, when is a combined RFQ/RFP appropriate?
We generally think that I assume the questioner means that you do an RFQ first and followed by an RFP. And we really prefer that in most instances. Most communities are not that patient, but we think that they should be, because it allows you a chance to understand what you're getting yourself into. You will learn a lot by doing these processes. So doing the RFQ first, seeing who's out there, getting interest, narrowing it down, adds education to the process. It also brings that wide list that you can shortlist, and then with the straight face go out to the short list with the much more detailed RFP. So in almost every instance, we suggest that, except when you don't know what you want to build, and that means you probably just want to go out for an RFQ.
Okay. Have you experienced any transit-oriented development projects? And if so, are you seeing a trend with project development along transit facilities?
We have. We see a lot of communities trying to get TOD projects going. Usually you will want to make sure that there is a transit node in place first, or is definitely going to happen, and know what the timeline of that node development is going to be, so that you're not attempting to build something for a future transit node that doesn't exist and may not exist. You really want to make sure that that node is a done deal. I'm not sure what other trends related to TOD that you're looking for, but we have seen those be fairly popular. But the instance of new transit lines being developed is not as rapid as I think everybody wants it to be. So the actuality is not as much as what people are wanting it to be.
Great. Our next question is, what is the best way to get out the RFP or RFQs to potential developers?
Again, I think one good way is definitely to you could do a press release to not only your newspaper but to various groups out there. International Economic Development Council, the International Downtown Association does was it every 2 weeks or every month? They send out an email to all their members with not only job postings but RFPs and RFQs that are on the street. So the International Council of Shopping Centers, all these groups out there, the APA, will put these out there, but like I said, also clearinghouses like Onvia. And then you can also have a consultant who has worked with a lot of developers send it to their list of qualified developers too, because there are a lot of developers out there, local, regional, and national, but they specify, they're qualified in very specific things usually. It's not like all developers are the same. And so it's good to work with someone who knows that group of developers. So for example, the list of folks we would send RFPs to for a convention hotel is not really long, but it's very specific to those that we know who have performed well in the past. That's a completely different list than a mixed-use, entertainment-based developer RFQ or P, that list that we would send out to a whole wide range of groups that have done things around the world. So it's good to have both the electronic means, but also to have those folks who have worked with those groups before help you get those out in front of people.
Great. Our next question is, what type of market analysis / data do developers look for in an RFP?
The more specific, the better. Typically, when we're hired to do a market and financial feasibility study, it's important that you know. It's funny. A lot of people say, "Oh, we've had a marketing study done." And I say, "Well, what's a marketing study?" We're looking at the market, and then we're taking the information from the market and turning it into a recommended project. And from that recommended project, we're seeing how that's going to perform financially in the market. And so what you want is both a market and financial feasibility study that takes you all the way through how this thing's going to perform, line item by line item, how much it's probably going to cost, and what the financial funding situation is going to be for that. So a lot of times when, and again, I'll use a hotel as an example, we understand what banks are willing to lend for that kind of project. We understand what equity sources are willing to do in terms of the return on investment, and we know how much these projects are going to cost. Based on that information, we can tell you what your gap is likely going to be. We can also tell you that a lot of projects are sometimes publicly financed in their entirety, as opposed to like arenas or convention centers or performing arts facilities, and there isn't much of a private involvement except as maybe as a management company. So those are all the things that a good consultant can tell you through their study. And so the more information that's going to be in there, the better, because then developers will know that you've done your homework. If you've just had kind of a quick and dirty study done, or you've done it all kind of in-house, we see that a lot of times where a community will try to do like their own in-house little study, and it just does not inspire confidence, because you go, wow, this is a do-it-yourself job. You're just not going to get the response.
Okay, so our next question is there a publicly available website that keeps examples of excellent RFP files?
If there is, I'm looking at Matthew. If there is, I'm not aware of it. You can usually go to developers and consultants and others who respond to these all the time and ask them and say, hey, we want to issue something. Can you send us some copies of ones that you've responded to that you thought were especially well written? We do that all the time. We'll send examples of ones that are well done, or we'll actually, again, you can hire someone to help you write one well, because again, then you'll save a lot more time and energy and wasted time down the road if you write one correctly. So not that you can't do it yourself. We've seen very well written ones done completely without assistance, but again, it's helpful to have some go-bys that you can get from others who have responded to those in the past.
Great. Our next question is, how do you keep developer interest in a project when the public keeps squashing components that are crucial to the economic feasibility?
That is tough, and that's your kind of local challenge, is you really want to make sure that you have as many ducks in a row as you can locally before you go out to the market. So if there are various incentives that are going to be necessary to make this project work, you want to make sure you have those in place, because if you're still kind of working on, say, a USDA grant or new market tax credits you think you might be able to get, but you don't really understand them, whatever the case may be, or you might be in a district but it hasn't been approved yet, I would make sure you get those taken care of first. If you launch the developer selection process too early, before you've done your homework, before you've gotten those things put in place, you could be looking at a bit of a mess.
All right. In regards to the TOD, would you consider a development along a bus rapid transit line, or do you feel only fixed rail is a safe bet?
I think that really depends on the situation. It really depends on how dense the market is, how dense the neighborhood is, the population in that area. and the community. In certain communities, taking the bus is looked down upon. In other communities, like in Chicago or New York and many other large cities, it is just as nice or nicer than taking the train, and people do it as a matter of course all the time. And it is very helpful to have TOD along those major stops and routes. So it really, what I would say is if you're trying to take a system from being kind of the transportation of last resort to something that more and more people rely upon, but it's not there yet in the public's eye, you're going to have a hard time convincing a developer to put their capital at risk trying to build a TOD, because then they're going to have to convince the public, okay, live along this route that you don't necessarily have confidence in. So, you know, as planners, I think we like to think that everybody's on board with us in terms of what we think can happen, but if they're not there yet, they're not there yet, and it's going to be hard to convince a developer. And even if you've convinced a developer, then the developer's got to convince their banker. And again, you know, if you don't have any go-bys, if you don't have any examples of success elsewhere in your community, it's going to be tough.
All right, so our next question is, are there any specific softwares or group of softwares that developers are using in their feasibility studies, and what do you use, if any?
You know, the answer is no. Every study is unique to the project. The process and methodology is similar. We're looking at the local market conditions. We're looking at local supply and demand, the quality of supply, the amount of demand, the level of intensity of demand. Is there any unaccommodated demand? What's been done in other places? We're looking at the competitive environment, but also the comparable facilities that have been built. And then based on that, what assumptions can we make for revenue and expenses that are realistic? And so we are generally, I mean, we have models that we use. We have a different model that we use for economic impact studies. We have a different model that we use for a residential development versus a hotel development versus a performing arts development versus an arena versus a convention center. They all have similar kind of, you know, you're looking at revenue and expenses, but at the end of the day, they all are different businesses and different models. So you have to understand those markets in order to generate it. But it's not like you can just buy a software package and punch it in. Now, when it comes to valuing a project, there are some relatively simple valuation models that you can run based on net operating income, but that's a little bit more specific than I think we want to get into today.
Okay, so do any of the RFPs with glaring mistakes in them result in a lower response rate, or does it diminish the return of quality developers in response?
The answer is absolutely yes. There are RFPs that will result in no responses very often. We see it all the time. And when I teach these classes, say to folks at, you know, in person live, where I can actually see them and say, raise your hand if you've had a failed RFP process or an RFP process that didn't, you know, meet your expectations, almost everyone raises their hand. And that's why I feel like this is such a necessary kind of class to go through, because you have to do your homework. You have to kind of get your ducks in a row as best you can, because we've seen so many of these fishing expeditions where somebody says, hey, you know, we really want to do XYZ development, and nobody responds. Well, the reason no one responds is there's no confidence that the city knows what they're doing. And the more times you put one on the street, because we all have Google alerts now, and so if we're interested in a community, it pops up every time, every morning that we check, and we say, oh, there goes, what's the community in North Carolina? Wilmington. There goes Wilmington again. Their fourth time doing an RFP, and they still didn't get it right. Well, finally they hired someone to help them through the process. Hopefully they'll get it right this time. But people pay attention to that, developers, consultants, and you start to write off communities that keep screwing it up. So you definitely want to do it right the first time, because people will absolutely not respond. And we've gotten calls even on a consulting basis where we've chosen not to respond to someone that wanted to do just a study, but they wrote their RFP so confusingly that we said, you know what, it's not worth our time. Then they called us back later and said, why didn't we get any responses? And we said, well, we couldn't figure out what you wanted. Your budget was too low. It just wasn't worth the time. So then they rewrote it, tried again, and had a successful result.
Okay, so what is a good way to educate the public about public incentives, which may be seen as giving public money away?
You know, that's where we feel like the economic impact analysis, which is really an economic, employment, and fiscal impact analysis, is really key to any sort of public-private project and any sort of analysis. You know, don't do a feasibility study without doing that analysis as well. It's going to cost you more, probably $10,000 to $20,000 more than a normal feasibility study to have that impact analysis done as a part of it. But at the end, what that really is the public's return on investment. So let's say, again, you had that $100 million project that was only worth 80, but if it generates, you know, 200 jobs and the economic activity in your community is going to go up by $100 million a year because of this project, and there are going to be, you know, X million dollars of property taxes generated, X million dollars of sales taxes generated, and income taxes generated every year over the life of the project, then you can say this is the return to the community. And so of this $40 million return over X period of time, we are going to just reinvest a portion of that back into this project. And so, but for this project, these monies wouldn't exist in the public coffers. So we're not taking money out of our budget per se. We are taking money that would be generated for the public out of this project anyway and turning it back to make the project actually work. And then once those monies are paid, all the rest is gravy to the public. So we tend to look at it as more of a return on investment.
Okay, great. Well, that's actually all the questions I have for you today. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really great, and I think everybody really enjoyed it. For those of you who are still in attendance, I'm just going to go through a few reminders in a moment about logging your CM credits.
And can I just interrupt one thing quickly? We did not put our contact information on here. If you have further questions, you can email me at rhunden@hundenpartners.com, or you can give us a call here at the office at 312-933, excuse me, that's my cell, 312-643-2500 is our office number.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so first off, to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please go to www.planning.org/CM, select today's date, which is September 16th, and then select today's webcast, Successful Developer RFP Processes, the Do's and Don'ts. This webcast is available for 1.5 CM credits. We are also recording today's session, so you will be able to find a recording of this webcast along with a 6-slide per page PDF at www.utah-apa.org/webcast-archive. This does conclude today's session, and I want to thank everyone again for attending.